But yeah, this is session 2 of becoming a better film critic, and I've titled this one "What Makes Films Mean," as you can see there. So I'm kind of moving on to forms and approaches of interpretation. So in the first session, we kind of began with the broader question of what criticism is for and kind of what it is in an abstract, even sort of philosophical sense. So the emphasis there was on criticism as more than reaction or taste or consumer guidance or, a deep dive into somebody's kind of personal reflection of what a meaning of a film is. We thought there about criticism of a form of judgment, but not just simply the narrow sense of issuing a verdict, let's say. We started thinking about the idea that criticism is not just something that happens privately inside the viewer. So it enters the world. It has to kind of make that gesture or that moves. It proposes a way of seeing, and it kind of by implication asks other people to test, to challenge, to extend, or to resist that response. But there's a sort of bringing along that goes on with criticism. So in some ways, you could sort of say that criticism is always social, even when it begins with something that's intensely subjective. So in this second session, I want to move on to a kind of next stage of the process. And I do want to resist that sort of idea of linearity here, but I think it just helps to kind of see criticism that involves judgment, obviously, but then we get to the point of kind of interpretation and how we might understand that as one of the main methods, of, if not the main method, by which judgment can become meaningful. So we're going to look at how interpretation is how the critic makes sense of the film before deciding what kind of claim can be made about it. It's the movement from I noticed this to this might matter because, and then maybe even eventually to this is what the film does, and this is why it succeeds, fails, troubles, or compels me, whatever other value judgment we might want to imbue it with. So maybe a key question we might think about is how might we understand meaning making through interpretation, which is not quite the same thing as what does the film mean? And I'll make that separation as we go along. Because that question can sometimes imply that meaning is already sitting inside the film, waiting to be extracted by a sufficiently clever critic. And we were talking a little bit last week about the who gets to be a critic and what are the kind of criteria and the status and the education and the positioning that critics we might imbue them with. But instead, we're going to think a little bit about interpretation as an activity. So critics select details, they infer patterns, they draw connections, bring context to bear, and then argue those meanings into visibility. And I'm going to be using Bordwell's book, Making Meaning, to sort of talk about this. He asks us to look not only at films, but at the habits and the procedures of criticism itself. So how do critics actually produce meanings? So it's going to be interesting to get your take on that idea of kind of reversing this implied idea that we often make that films hold a meaning somehow. They're there to be discovered. And instead sort of look at this idea that the moment of interpretation or the process of interpretation is actually imbuing the meaning itself, right? So we're going to look at how do we move from description to interpretation? How do certain kinds of readings become normalized or plausible or institutionally valued? And we're going to sort of draw upon Bordwell to help us see that interpretation is shaped by critical traditions and habits of attention and institutionalized context and shared conventions. Excuse me. That leads us to one of the central claims of the session, that interpretation is always framed. And I'm going to take you through one of those frames, which is auteur theory. Now, I'll make the transition to say there are almost innumerable amounts of frames that you could sort of talk about in terms of how that underpins or shapes or defines the way in which criticism is constructed by the critic, right? But auteur theory, I think, because it's so prevalent, you know what I mean? It's a sort of theory that imbues it kind of is attached or used through so many different criteria, whether it's implicitly or explicitly. It gives critics a way of reading a film through the figure of the director as the organizing intelligence or the organizing vision. So we're going to look at that in quite a lot of detail. So Bordwell's provocation, this idea that critics and scholars make meaning. So I don't know, I mean, most of you will probably have heard of David Bordwell, along with his partner, Kirsten Thompson. And they are among the most prolific and widely cited film scholars and critics. And they kind of move across scholarship and academia into, broader aspects of film criticism, I think, well, at least while Bordwell was around. And their work is the kind of stuff that at undergraduate level you'll get given the book, like Film Art, for example, is one of the first key texts that we were asked to kind of buy when you were asked to buy books back at university. And this book, which is just David Bordwell's, is called Making Meaning. Obviously, I've talked about that, but it's a major work that comes after narration in the fiction film and the classical Hollywood cinema, which are the two sort of initial books that were written. But in this one, he turns his attention to how films are structured and how critics and scholars produce the interpretations of them. So its importance lies in the fact that it doesn't simply ask what films mean, but how meaning is made through inference, through pattern recognition, through critical habits, and, as I've said, through institutional traditions, but also through rhetorical argument. So I think to sort of sum up overall what he's getting at with this book, Bordwell is skeptical of criticism that treats interpretation as the excavation of hidden content, particularly when films are too quickly turned into symptoms of ideology or products of psychology or reading through cultural contradictions. The crucial move is to avoid treating meaning as a buried object. And this is at odds with much of the way that contemporary film criticism is written, I would argue. And again, it's something we'll come back to, particularly when we're looking at that question in later weeks, when we're looking at ideology versus aesthetics. And again, it's something that I'd be interested in hear what people's takes are on this. So for Bordwell, and the critic's task is to make the relationship between the elements that are there to be read in the film as legible. So images, sounds, performances, stories, genres, stars, industrial conditions, and even cultural memories. All of these might provide a framework that then the task is to make legible the relationship between those elements. A phrase that he returns to is this idea of accountable attention. It's a sort of disciplined proposal about what becomes significant when we look carefully and choose an appropriate frame. Now, the book is definitely not against, it doesn't produce an argument against interpretation altogether or suggest a kind of free-for-all that you can actually make any kind of meaning up that you want. Rather, it asks critics to become more conscious of the procedures by which they move from description to interpretation and then from interpretation to judgment. So inference, he's got this in the title, obviously. The subtitle there is Inference and Rhetoric in the Interpretation of Cinema. So the inference aspect of it is the first crucial term. A critic notices something, but the meaning of that detail is not automatic and is not self-evident. The critic has to infer its significance. So if a film repeatedly frames a character, say, through doorways, is that about entrapment? Is that about secrecy? Is that about domestic space? Is it about surveillance? Is it about emotional distance? Or is it just a kind of compositional habit? Now, the answer to that depends on how that detail relates to other details in the film. So the inference is a formation of a claim based on the articulation of the relationship between cues. So he's kind of against this idea of singular, heavy-handed notions of symbolism. Like there's a sense in which this moment that we might see visually, let's say, for example, the use of the color red, is obviously symbolizing some aspect. It may do, but it has to be in relation to other aspects of the film that make that reading possible or make that reading viable, right? So he wants to kind of avoid treating interpretation as revelation. So the critic is asking, what is the film making available to us? The critic does not simply find the hidden meaning inside the film. They construct a reading from the evidence of what the film is making available for us to read. And again, like I say, that does not make the reading arbitrary. It means that interpretation is a disciplined act of making this connection. So critics have to decide, what are they selecting? What are they connecting together? What patterns are being proposed? What does this reading explain that a looser or weaker reading would not? So again, even within that, the selection of the kinds of things that you are relating together is really important. And that's where there is a sort of way in which the subjective and the objective can kind of come together. So if the film is making something available for us to read, in the way that it's producing, its potential readings, right? Then it's up to the critic to be able to look in that kind of subjective way, but then select the aspects of those connections that critic wants to make. And obviously, there will be a lot of shared readings, but there may be aspects of the reading that are not shared or not picked up in an obvious way. So again, this is where the kind of subjective aspect or the sense of the critic's own consciousness might come to bear on something that might push it beyond a shared objective reading. Now, alongside this, because of that, the reading then has to become persuasive through rhetorical choices. So the ordering of evidence, the confidence or caution of the language, the use of examples, the way that they are articulated, the appeal to particular theoretical or conceptual possibilities, the invocation, say, of genre or history or authorship or ideology, all of these kinds of things then. And plus, on top of that, the sense of a subjective feeling or memory or emotion. So criticism is not just analysis in that way. It's written persuasion that's based on what Bordwell talks about as a kind of persuasive evidence. So then what we might say that at its best, criticism opens up the film, perhaps into a different circuit of consciousness, which a reader or a different critic might not have had access to, but gains access through that because of what the critic has elucidated, has noticed, and then put into a form.